Thank you, everybody, for listening to us today. My name is Carol Kerven. I am a social anthropologist by training, more in human ecology than anything else. And I've been working for about 40 odd years with pastoral peoples around the world, looking at their economic and ecological situations and how those things interact. And I've been working in doing research and doing development work with pastoralists in the former Soviet Union since about 1995. So my presentation today is a little bit off perhaps some of the mainstream themes, but I persuaded Pablo to accept it. What I've done is I've taken an historical approach to understanding where things appear to be at the moment in Kazakhstan. You can go to the next screen. So the first thing that is extremely impressive, especially for those of us who have worked in more well-known, shall we say, globally well-known rangelands like the American West or the South American Pampas, or indeed East Africa, where I grew up. The impressive thing about Eurasia, which we sort of take from kind of the Western, well, Turkey, all the way over to the Pacific, to the Mongol, to the Chinese areas. The impressive thing is the size of these rangelands, and the best estimates is that they form the biggest contiguous areas of pasture, which I take to mean places which have a use for humans and are used or have been used by humans. Now, I'm focusing really only on Kazakhstan, and I hope I can discipline myself not to stray too much. But Kazakhstan is huge, and about 85–86% of all of Kazakhstan is considered to be comprised pastures or rangelands, with about 1.9 million square kilometers. And this map, just the pink is the sort of desert, there's the arid and semi-arid, goes from sort of 100 to 300 mils per year rain of precipitation, a lot of which falls as snow. And then you have the great grasslands, the steppes as they're called. And then you have some shrubby, woody areas, and then not really very much in Kazakhstan, kind of snow covered. So these are, I'm going to talk around these, and you'll all be able to read the paper if you're interested. Being a social scientist, but working always with, and I should have mentioned at the beginning, this is a co-authored paper with Sarah Robinson, who is a rangeland scientist associated with the zoology department at Oxford University, and a fellow I've known for about 40 odd years called Roy Benke, who's the ideas man. And he and I have worked together in Kazakhstan, along with Sarah, for about off and on 20 years. So it's very much a co-authored paper with different people's inputs and data management systems and skills. So as a social scientist in this, what interests me is how people decide to get together and manage or unmanage or rearrange the way that their animals are going to be looked after at a very basic level. And I think working in multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary teams is really the only way to understand how these kinds of agricultural systems really function. And it's also a terrific way to learn from other people. So in Kazakhstan, we've got a tremendous variety of productive areas for livestock. As I say, going from what looks like unpromising sand deserts, sand dunes, which spring to life in the after the snow has melted, and are covered with a sort of green fur, which is all the ephemerals, which are highly nutritious. They're very short and full of protein. So my range ecologists tell me. and tulips and those kinds of things. And then it goes all the way up to alpine meadows, where you've got the sort of classic floristic composition of grasses and flowers, a lot of flowers, and some trees. Now, the archaeologists, and here we have this, the value of working with different disciplines, have been in the last 10, 15 years really burrowing down to try to understand how a livestock or domesticated animals have been managed in these rangelands. And a lot of it has to be speculation and hypotheses, but they pretty much have put together a picture which resembles what some of the contemporary period looks like, which is tracking, essentially, tracking across these very distinctive ecological zones with their livestock, spreading seeds as they go. And they've now sort of taken it back for Kazakhstan to around 5,000 years of domesticated livestock movements across these different zones. And these are basically latitudinal, so they go from the southern part, which is warmer, all the way up to the edge of the forest zone on the Russian border in the north. And then they also are altitudinal, the classic transhumance systems that we know from the Alps and from Western US and Europe, and and parts of Africa as well, where people will go up on classically in the Himalayas, where the pastoralists will take their animals up slope for the summer, warmer season, to graze the meadows, and then bring them down to more sheltered areas, and often have to depend on cut fodder for the winter period. So in order to manage these herds and flocks, it's mostly sheep and some goats, and later on, and horses were very important in Kazakhstan. In order to manage these flocks and herds, in the past, and the Russian Imperial Russia and Tsarist period, so I mentioned that this migratory system is documented to be about 5,000 years old. And also in that process, there's been a lot of innovations, in particular, the use of the horse as a riding animal and also for meat. Then later on, some introduction of more settled, in some areas, more settled pastoralism, depending more on barley and rye, and the aftermath of that for winter feed. The picture, the sepia picture on the left, was taken in about 1860s, and here we've got now the role of the Russians in this story. So Russian military, I don't know what to call it, invasion, but colonialism spread into the areas of northern Kazakhstan around the 17th century, and gradually established forts, and later on established some sort of rule administration. And so these photographs were taken in about 1860, and they show how Kazakh nomads would have moved. They had the Bactrian camels, with the double hump, and of course the yurts, which I believe, I cannot say that Kazakhs can claim having invented the yurt. I believe they were most earliest found in Turkey. And there you have the horses. And now the other innovation, which is still in the modern period, is the scythe, which was for the preparation of winter feed. Now, my paper really is focused on 100 years, the last 100 years, because there have been three enormous, devastating political changes, political and economic changes, which have had a huge effect, and sometimes extremely awful effect, on the people and their animals, and then also on the environment. And this has been very, very well documented. and it's an absolute treasure trove for researchers, especially ones who speak Russian, as my colleague Sarah Robinson, the second author, is a very fluent Russian speaker and reader. So the Russians were and are still a very literate, the elite were educated. They documented things, they sent scientists, they sent sort of early ethnographers. And so they documented a lot, which gives us a very interesting base, historically based, as opposed to the prehistoric, which would be the archaeological, which is more speculative. So if we look at the historical base, what were the pastoralists doing 200 years ago? And we've got some pretty good evidence for how they moved and where they moved. But there was the first big, I'm not going to spend much time talking about the Russian period because there were many changes, but I'm going to really start the story with the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. And then the Bolsheviks, once they consolidated power from the Russian Tsarist regime, they then put a massive amount of thought and effort and force into transforming the peoples that they found. And here I'm just going to focus again on the pastoralists and their livestock. So the first policy, very clear policy decision that the Bolsheviks made, the communists, was to decide to sedentarize these people. Now, there were several reasons, as always, for this decision. One was ideological, that they thought that this was a primitive form of production. Another one was that a lot of Russian peasants, after the emancipation of the serfs in Russia, poor people wanted land, and they wanted good land for farming. And the best land for farming, which was the better watered land, was in northern Kazakhstan. I'm speaking Kazakhstan as if it was, a country then, its modern day boundaries. So a lot of Slav farmers moved in, and this happened to be the northern pastures of the Kazakh nomads. A bit of a problem. So part of the ideological transformation was that, in addition to seeing that this was perceiving this as an uncivilized or barbaric or nomadism, it was also to gain some access to these steppe grasses, the long what you would call the long grass prairie, Lynn, I believe. And when I've worked with American range scientists in Kazakhstan, they just shake their heads. They say, well, these are the same. We took agropyron and these steepers and things. We took them from there and brought them to America. It's fascinating. So now we begin the first big tragedy, which was what is called Stalin's Terror in around 1930s, beginning of the 1930s, when the people were forcibly collectivized. Many of their traditional tribal leaders were simply killed because they were seen to be kulaks, or what would we call them now? Rich people who were feudal lords, which was actually historically probably quite incorrect. But anyway, their animals were taken away. They were forced to settle in remote places. No provision was made for winter feed. And basically many animals died and many people died. Then the Second World War came, and scientists, meanwhile, who let's say were less politically motivated and more objective, began to actually go and do field work and see what these nomads were up to. And they began to realize that, I think this shows at the end of the 19th century. This shows, if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see the scale, that little horizontal line, 400 kilometers. These were the pastoral movements that were recorded by the ethnographers by the end of the 19th century. And this is what the first communist government attempted to, and to partly succeeded in, completely annihilating these huge movements. This map still impresses me terrifically every time I look at it. I've looked at it for 20 years. These were the nomadic routes across Kazakhstan. Right, so what was then destroyed in the initial sedentarization that started in the early 30s was the way in which the small groups of people led by elder men, which we're calling subclans, had moved. So they had moved as a group, partly for protection against marauders, but also because sharing labor, sharing responsibility of herding, etc. And at the managerial level, if you want to say, the different elders of these subclans would get together annually and discuss who was going to go where. So when we who have never experienced livestock management like that, we ask, well, how do people decide where to go when you have communal land tenure? And it's a really good question. And the answer is that people do decide where to go because they send representatives from each minimal group of people, subclan, if you like, to meet with each other. And it looks like they're all sitting under a tree, you know, smoking pipes and drinking beer. But actually what they're doing is deciding where people, different groups of people are going to go, so they don't all end up in the same place or misuse the resources or overuse the resources. That they actually have a way of decision making, which is a little bit invisible if you don't hang around and watch. But anyway, so that's what the Russians' record left us, was that people were making decisions by sending their elders to collective areas. So collectivization, early collectivization, is recognized as a complete disaster. Famine. And this was the suppression of the mobile system. People were forced to just hunker down, and many animals died because of lack of winter fodder, and many people died or left to foreign neighboring countries, to China, actually Western China, and to Iran. Those were the two main places. Yeah. Now, with the Second World War, and the Soviet scientists, as I say, began to spend more time in the rangelands, watching what people did, and they were botanists. The scientists were botanists and livestock scientists and breeders as well, and they began to think that there might be something valuable in this nomadic system, because it was more cost effective, was one of the main conclusions they reached, that you didn't have to rely so much on cultivated feed, and you could actually, and also the types of plants that could be grazed in different seasons, where the nomads knew which were at which point they were at their optimum nutrition. So that's why they would move from the desert in the winter, in which the animals had access to a lot of seeds from the plants, from the trees and the shrubs, which of course were high in protein. And then they just had some sort of coarse hay, which they would have cut and prepared. And then they would move on to the spring pastures, which had these ephemerals and very short grass. Of course, immediately I've forgotten all the names because I'm so tired here. Then they would move into the summer steppe, the long grass prairies. And then as soon as they had seeded out, they would begin the reverse migration down to the south for protection against the very severe cold. So anyway, so the Soviet scientists began to say, well, maybe we should, go back to this. So they did. They actually reintroduced the migratory long distance migration, but with one huge difference. And that was that the central planning system, the central planners based in Moscow, really wanted to increase livestock output to feed the population. it was meat mostly, but also a lot of a lot of wool because of the Russian cold winters. So wool became very important as a commodity within the collectivized market economy, within the communist market economy. And so what they did in Moscow was they actually began to massively subsidize from the more industrialized parts of the Western Soviet Union. They began to inject money into the eastern part, like Kazakhstan, to what I've called industrialized nomadism. The nomadic management system continued, but with huge infrastructure of bridges and barns and harvesting machinery. There's little pastoral communities were connected to the national grid. Water wells were sunk using pumps. The whole thing was transformed in a very, very startling manner, and became, produced many, many more livestock, mostly sheep was the big one. And then for the human side, the people who'd formerly operated as small family groups in this kind of clan structure became workers with a division of labor. So some people who were very good at handling animals and perhaps weren't very good in school and didn't pass all their exams or something, they would, because schools were also introduced. And me as a British colonialist, I'm still so impressed by what the Russians did. So those who didn't, who really weren't sort of academically inclined, shall we say, they remained as shepherds, just taking the animals out on horse and on foot. And then people who were more academic, they would become veterinarians or agronomists or water engineers. They introduced irrigation, livestock breeders, which was hugely important. I think they developed 15 different breeds of sheep in Kazakhstan, 15. Crossing the indigenous breeds with, merinos and other imported, including from the US. And then, of course, our beloved farm directors, the collective farm directors, who are a special category of people, never to be forgotten. Great vodka drinkers and very autocratic, because they were managing farms of, say, 50,000 sheep. With all these professional staff, etc. They would have villages of 4,000 or 5,000 people that were all responsible for one collective farm, one farm. So just to give you a few figures here. So here on the left, we have 1913. This is the sheep and goats in millions of heads. Again, as I said, the Russians were very good at collecting data as well as analyzing what was going on. And the red line is cattle. And if you look at the 1930s, which is about 5 or 6 lines across on the horizontal axis, you'll see what happened with the first collectivization, how animals just died, basically. And then, there's missing data. And then we come to the 1980s, when you can see how many more livestock there were, especially sheep and goats. I hope nobody asks me about goats, because you won't get rid of me for the next hour. So, so now we come to the next crisis, which is 1997, which is where my story will go next, where you'll see this huge drop. So next slide, please. Now, so here we had 70 years of communist rule, which was pretty much pulled apart, or all the support was withdrawn within the space of about 2 years. So the official end of the USSR was 1991. By 1995, when I first got there, those huge livestock farms with 50,000 sheep and whole villages no longer got any support from the government. So the system had been that each farm had a quota that they had to produce of live animals and skins and wool. And so everything was controlled, all the finances were controlled centrally. So when the subsidy from Moscow disappeared, all the people were left with was sheep and tractors and wells, but no fuel to run the pumps of the wells. I mean, it was amazing. And we were incredibly lucky to actually start doing our field work in 1995, and actually to see people were stealing the telephone wires. They were stealing the pieces of any metal and selling it to China, because people they had no wages. Everything just vanished. They were eating all their sheep. People would come with a lamb on the back of a horse, and try and swap it for a bag of flour. It was very dire. But remember those people who were trained as veterinarians and agronomists and farm directors? They were in a very different position, because they could actually physically get their hands on what was left behind. And those were the tractors, the big Russian trucks, the pumps for the wells. We're talking about, generally in most of the areas, relies on groundwater. There's very few rivers and lakes. So it's generally groundwater, and water is the key resource in most of the rangelands area. So without pumps, they couldn't draw water from the wells, because the wells were too deep, because the Russians had put in boreholes. So you began to have this amazing division between the haves and the have-nots, the people who could grab the key resources, and that included the livestock, because when the farms collapsed, some of the 50,000 sheep had to go somewhere, and a lot of them went into people's private flocks. So it was a whole process of privatization. And then as some people, the educated elite and a few shepherds who had been what they call generals, the people who were really, really good shepherds, very smart people, basically, they also sort of, got their eyes on a truck and privatized it and began taking sheep to market. Markets hadn't existed before, because everything was sent by the farm, the state farm, to a factory, to a meat combinat, and slaughtered and then packed and processed and sent to the shops. Nobody really stored it at home or anything like that. So suddenly private markets started up, and people would just come in, on foot, bringing sheep or on trucks. So by the early 21st century, these bigger livestock owners were becoming ranchers. Now, no fencing. The land system is very complicated, and Roy talks much more about that than me. But basically, there's state land, there's village land, and then there is leased land, because one part of the story that I'm not going to elaborate in this talk is the role of the Western financial and development organizations, the World Bank, the UN agencies, the Asian Development Bank. They had a very big role also in the post-Soviet, starting from the early 1990s. And they believed very much in private land tenure, and they convinced, they took these directors that I was talking about, the vodka drinking brigade, they would take them to the Western US, to Australia, to New Zealand, and they would show them, what does a modern sheep or cattle ranch look like? And those guys were seriously impressed. They'd heard about them, they'd read about them, they'd never seen them. And I even took a group of Central Asians, not only Kazakhs, to the UK, to Britain in 1996, and took them to see Scottish and Welsh and English farms. Not as impressive though as American ones. Not, well, the sheep farming in Wales impressed them, but because it was communal private land, and they'd never thought about that before. They'd never thought that you could have your own farm, you know, fenced and everything, but then you could use state land, which in Wales is national park land. So that was, you know, very interesting to see, you know, this, you could sort of combine things as well. And I'm speaking here very much here to Lynn. So they're unfenced, but they are leased on now 50-year leases. And this was brought about mainly through the influence of the Western development and financial agencies, with loans as well from the World Bank. So now these bigger livestock owners, they employ people, and very, very interesting is they are returning to livestock mobility, there having been a hiatus in moving animals for about 15 years because nobody really had the means to do so, and they didn't have the pumps, you know, when they went to these remote wells, they couldn't water their animals. So they began to do that. Meanwhile, the bulk of the people who didn't have very many animals and didn't have resources could only graze their animals around the villages. And this, not surprisingly, has led to quite large-scale degradation and defoliation around villages. And winter feed, again, you know, everything had to be purchased, so it became very expensive and poor quality because they didn't have the tractors and the supplement to refeed, because people were eating instead of growing, as had been done in the latter Soviet period, instead of growing maize and barley and stuff to feed animals, people were eating it. So the animals, you know, weren't as productive and reproductive. So this is what a modern Kazakh ranch looks like. And so this is the winter quarters. And he has, through a combination of his own family investment, and this is also quite an important point, is that one of the ways that the richer people have reconstructed very viable and profitable farms is by pulling in their kin. So you'll have one of your brothers will be have a job in the city, and you know, he'll send out solar panels, for example, because there's no electricity in these places. Another brother will have a farm where he'll grow maize, and then, you know, some of the maize will be made available. Your nephews and your nieces, you know, will help to go out to manage the animals, but a lot of the big ranches actually just employ people, and quite often people from across the border who are even poorer than them. So they kind of come in as migrant workers. So on the bottom picture there is an old Soviet wagon where people live, and they have a little stove, and they use charcoal, and there's a little kitchen outside, and then I believe that is a Japanese truck on the side there. So you have a combination of the old and new going on in that picture. Okay, now environmental impacts. Two big things have happened that have had inevitably environmental impacts. One is the redistribution of livestock from large farm areas into private hands and no hands. So the ecologists have been very studiously examining the effects of this on this huge territory. A lot of the land has been abandoned that was grazed, that was cropped. This is not economic now without those Moscow subsidies, and it's returning to rangeland. So, and some land that was grazed before quite heavily by those 50,000 farm sheep is now only being maybe grazed by 10,000 sheep. So, all the vegetation is is changing. Livestock numbers crashed, as you saw in that graph, by 1995, but they're rising up again. So there's a lot of changes happening, and one of the ecologists has come to the conclusion the grazing is mandatory to fully restore the near-natural steppe vegetation and the underlying processes of pyrrhic herbivory. There's controversy, of course, about this, and this is probably one of the things that would be most interesting to discuss afterwards. But definitely the other ecologists who are looking at the animal rather than the plant changes are seeing very positive changes, that bird life is coming back because the heavy grazing in some areas and then very light grazing in other areas rather than more evenly spread. There's been also a lot of remote sensing on greenhouse gas emissions, which is again seeing more carbon sequestration and sequestration of other reduction in other greenhouse gases. And so it's an area of interest. And it is, well, as I said, I haven't really talked about the role of foreign investment, foreign advice, etc. But I think one of the surprising things is that more people aren't studying this. There's almost a complete dearth of post-Soviet science in this area. Basically, the government, the independent Kazakh government, was very focused on oil and gas exploration and extraction, and hasn't invested in training up young scientists, which is very unfortunate, and you know, it's almost a generation lost. But meanwhile, European and American scientists have been quite busy on the ground, but surprisingly few actually do field work. A lot of them do remote sensing. It's not an easy place to do field work. You end up, you know, sleeping on the floor and drinking a lot of vodka. But you sleep on the floor, not because you've drunk vodka, because there's nowhere else to sleep. So I hasten to make that point. So, so on the question of movement, which is really the question that I think is the most interesting one of all, these kinds of areas really profit from animals being moved across them and grazing them, I think seems to be the conclusion. It's also cheaper. It also uses less resources, carbon-based resources. But of course you can't go back, you know, to being nomadic. But what the ranchers are showing is how you can be a modern nomad. And that I think is fascinating. How you can do it with your mobile phones, with your Japanese trucks, with your employees, but you're still accessing all that ecological variability. And so you're making it more economically efficient, but you seem to be also helping to maintain biological diversity, ecological balances. So I will end by saying that some of the biggest projects that are being designed with external money are actually focused only on the bigger livestock owners. They don't consider that the smaller livestock owners who own the majority of livestock are efficient or are able and willing to make their livestock more productive, or to modernize, or however you want to call it. But the big thing is intensification. The big pressure is on creating essentially feedlot cattle farms and sheep farms to not to necessarily encourage movement. And this is one of the biggest discussions that has been going on since I've been involved in looking at this in Kazakhstan between the scientists and the policymakers is, do we encourage people to move, and how do we do that? Or do we encourage them to sort of settle down on their ranches and bring in additional feed? So, but I think that the last point I want to make is that the only way really to get any kind of answers to these questions is to work over time in the same places, to see what happens over time in the same places, when policies change, when the markets change, when prices change. And I'm going to end on goats because, as I said, sheep wool was the big commodity. There's almost no value now in sheep wool for various reasons, not least of which is synthetics have replaced wool to some extent for clothing. But goats have become very, very important. They were initially taken up by the poorest people, the people who had almost no livestock when they lost their jobs, because they multiplied much faster than sheep. They had a market value, and now they have a value in cashmere, which, you know, we could be going towards the Mongolian side of things. So thank you very much, all of you, for listening.
This is so fascinating, and I was trained as a political ecologist, so a lot of my understanding of the world comes from really digging deep into one place for a long time and trying to understand how some of those nuances, how some of those very dynamic, you know, human nature relationships change over time.
I like that about goats. They've been demonized as being responsible for destroying the environment in a lot of places, but it just depends on who manages them. But this was great, and I really enjoyed it. I learned so much. And I'm wondering, so when you say intensification towards the feedlots model, in the Western United States, we have, of course, the feedlot model, but it exists in tandem with a mobile, not as mobile as this, I'm sure, but a mobile livestock system where the younger animals are produced by cattle who are mobile and go up into the mountains and down into the lowlands through the year. But of course, the feedlot allows there to be ultimately more animals because they spend the last 2 months of their lives on, the young ones do, on feed. So is this a different model? Because I've also heard of intensification where it's year-round feeding in pens, and I'm wondering if you have a feel for where people want this, where this pressure wants them to go.
I think this emphasis on feedlots has really come up since I've been able to get back to Kazakhstan. So I'm a little bit vague about the details. I'll say that. But what I think is happening is that it's the old story of a Western in the biggest, you know, in the not the Western US, but a Western concept of how a modern ranch ought to look, and it should have more control over the animals' feed. I think that's one of the roots of the policy, and I think the idea of moving animals to where the feed is rather than bringing the feed to the animals, I think that's the key question. Because of course it costs also to move animals. You know, it's not a free thing. You've got to get them there, and you've got to have people to take them there. So I don't think that they're going to really set up. Well, I know they've set up intensive dairy farms. That's for sure. But already they've set those up. But I don't think that they are really talking about for year-round feedlots. I think they're talking about fattening farm. What do they call cow-calf operations?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's not a very satisfactory answer, but all I can say is that it's still an ongoing controversy in Kazakhstan between scientists and policymakers as to how much you should encourage movement for the health of the environment, and and how much you should rely on growing something to feed them. because that seems inefficient.
Yeah, it's interesting because the reason I think that we can have feedlots is because crops are so heavily subsidized. And here you're saying that, you know, the livestock now have to do without subsidies. And so this is changing everything. It's very interesting. Anyway, I'll need to let somebody else talk.
Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Carol. If I can, I want to ask you something. So I've seen a very similar thing happen across the Trans-Himalaya from where I did most of my work, where you have that additional problem of actual land borders being established across nation states, which rangelands don't really often conform to ecologically, culturally, in many ways. One thing which is very interesting to me is that there is this notion of labor mobility, right? And especially in the, let's say, the late stage industrial West, you know, mobility, especially within people that work in the service industry, which is a big part of the, I would say, educated elite, that's seen as almost like a proxy for a very modern family, a very modern kind of a situation. On the other hand, rurality and some of this primary production is seen tied to this more static, this more settled, this more kind of a sedentary kind of a lifestyle. And it's so interesting because herders, the transhumans, the mobility of it challenges this notion of what modernity is and how in various parts of the economy mobility should and should not be, you know, practiced. So it almost seems like there's this tussle happening for who gets to own the future of mobility and what that looks like. And it seems like in primary production, the state is often not as interested because they would rather just have individuals be mobile versus the whole system kind of transitioning through time. Sorry, I know that's like a lot of stuff I just said, but if you want to address that.
Wow. Well, there's a lot of big ideas there. I don't know, can you break it down a little bit more to questions?
Yeah. And so one question would be, you know, do you think that there are parts of the world where we're going towards a system of rurality and primary production, which is more mobile versus, you know, the way that, as you said, historically, there's been this kind of move by the state and by corporations, honestly, to sedentarize rural populations to get that intense, you know, that intensity out of it?
Well, there's one word there that I've never heard before, rurality. Rurality.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. I have to chew on that for a minute. Rurality. With regards to pastoralism, I mean, mobile versus non-mobile is a very big topic and very much discussed and researched these days. That's for sure. I mean, the standard explanation, which I don't know, I think it might be a little bit cliched or yeah, just not very strong, is that states want to control people, you know, and they don't want people wandering around and moving between cross borders and stuff. I think there's more to it than that. I don't necessarily reject that, but I think that certainly in Africa, a lot of mobile pastoral groups have become less mobile, but for positive reasons. And I think there's a real risk of romanticizing nomadism, or as anthropologists would say, essentializing it. Sure. Not all nomads are the same, and not all nomadic peoples behave in the same way or for the same reasons. So on the other hand, it behooves us to look at patterns and to look for patterns. So I kind of open-minded about that. I think that I think one has to be very, very careful of the outsider-insider position. I think when we're talking about pastoralists, and I'm speaking really now in my anthropological capacity, I think we have to be very careful to be aware that we may be creating a sort of us and them dichotomy, and that, you know, it's it's a very easy trap to fall into, and the romantic one as well. I mean, I've lived with nomadic peoples, and with their camels and yurts and all of that, and it is an amazing way of life, and admirable. But I don't think it necessarily has to always remain like that. It's quite an emotional subject, actually.
Right.
I think people have to examine themselves, what do I think is important and why do I think it's important, and make their own decisions, basically.